Hello lovely people! Thank you so much for your wonderful comments on my last video. Look, I am actually sitting up by myself. This is very special and new. I'm dedicating all of my content in the month of June to Pride because, well, every parade got rained on by the coronavirus and we need to bring out the sun. That's a rainbow pun. If this is your first time on the channel, hi, I'm Jessica. Yes, I do make cheesy jokes often, but I also make content about life as a disabled and chronically ill person who just happens to also be a lesbian. And yes, I look like this all the time. Subscribe if you enjoy not only vintage style, but also discussing why it's so great we don't live in vintage times anymore. I would be dead, for sure. In today's video, does Pride exclude disabled people? Yes! Okay, there is more to it than that, promise. LGBTQ+ Pride, or Gay Pride, as I have an unfortunate habit of calling it, and yes, I'm calling myself out for that, as we know it, is about celebrating differences, shouting out for everyone to be proud of their body, sexuality and physical appearance. It's also a time to remember and to reflect on the resilience, perseverance and unity of the LGBTQ+ community and how hard we have had to fight towards equality. I mean, but mainly it's about drinking. And while I have nothing against throwing a huge party just to celebrate existing, thanks to my disabilities I can't actually attend a lot of them. Apparently I'm bitter. Diversity and inclusion are touted as the main pillars of Pride, but people with disabilities are still often left out when it comes to the discussion and celebration of sexual and gender diversity. It was only in 2018 that the iconic Stonewall Inn bar denied entrance to a blind queer person because they didn't provide paperwork for their service dog, which is a violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which states that no paperwork is needed for the entrance of a service animal. And that event is purely notable because the person involved actually tried to get in. See, most disabled people don't say anything about inaccessible venues because we're just so bloody used to it. I mean, and we're just going to put a pin in impossible to enter venues. We do also have to deal with the desexualization of disabled people in general, the widely held belief that we can't have alternative sexualities because we can't be sexual in the first place. Which, by the way, is a really fun to experience, juxtaposed with the hypersexualization of my lesbianism. No one has ever yelled at my wife and I to kiss from a crowd when I'm in my wheelchair, but once I'm out of it, beware. The funny thing is that there are many parallels between the experiences of people with disabilities or chronic illnesses and lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender people. Both groups face discrimination and prejudice and are represented as other in society. Yet, part of this othering is about suppressing variation within the communities and viewing us as homogenous. I mean, I made a joke in my last video, but I think we're all pretty much aware of the poster look for Pride. He's white, he's cis, he's male, he spends way too much time at the gym, and his clothes just kind of fall off him in ways that would be completely unacceptable at any other time. Where are the gender non-conforming party goers? Where are the people from ethnic minorities? Where are visibly religious queer people? And could we just talk about how it's always the pretty gays or the people who pass? Equally, disabled people do not all look like this, the good old blue plaque that tells me where a very skinny version of me is welcome. But I'm an ambulatory wheelchair user, so that means I only use my wheelchair some of the time. For both groups, there's a level of exclusion and isolation that we face from the mainstream. The need for a safe, supportive space is therefore paramount for each community, a place of acceptance and understanding. Pride. So, what makes Pride inaccessible in the first place? Well, I made a video from Pride last year when I was using a borrowed mobility scooter, and you can click the card in the top left corner to see that. As you can see, the parade is pretty darn crowded, and drunk people aren't the most self-aware. Rather, they tend to like step in front of you, or talk over the top of your head, or get annoyed when they can't just walk over you. It's great. The ground is generally littered with cans, bottles, food cartons, and 1,000 rainbow trinkets that worked for 5 seconds and then got thrown away. You might be able to step over it, but try getting a wheel over it. The parade route of most prides includes areas that are uneven and they're all incredibly long, involving very narrow spaces, and even if there is a designated wheelchair path, oftentimes the parade coordinators underestimate the amount of space needed, or the path just becomes overcrowded with onlookers who think that it's fine to take up the disabled space because it won't really be used right. I mean, there aren't that many disabled queer people. A third, actually. 1/3 of LGBTQ+ people generally have some form of physical or mental disability, which, considering the underreporting of non-cis het feelings in surveys, is probably actually higher. So that's the route, but then we come to the event. Does it have a sign language interpreter? Do film screenings have captions? Are there spaces for participants with noise or light sensitivity, or who are on the autism spectrum? Is there a designated space for wheelchairs? Even when events try really, really hard, there can still be issues. Brighton Pride last year had a special inclusion tent, sign language interpreters on stage, and a designated platform for wheelchairs. But they still vastly underestimated how many wheelchair users would want to watch the stage at one time, meaning that throughout the biggest acts, a large number of people had to sit in the inclusion tent, which actually had no view of the stage, just waiting for someone to leave the platform so they could join. I actually just gave up with that queue, to be fair, after sitting in it for a while. Didn't need that. Those of us who use wheelchairs for big events are left at the mercy of crowds inside Pride events. Not even Moses could part those crowds. People are screaming, people are crying, people are laughing, people are fighting, people are doing things at a corner that you don't want to tell your mother about. And most of them are riotously drunk. Because wow, does Pride seem to be based around drinking? Why do we need to celebrate things with alcohol anyway? Don't answer that. I know I'm in a tiny minority of non-drinkers. This is something that applies to LGBTQ+ spaces all year round. They're generally upstairs or downstairs. They're crowded and smoky and noisy, and there are never signers or accessible toilet facilities, and largely that isn't the fault of the owners. It's a knock-on effect of how stigmatised our community has been in the past. Worried your lesbian bar was going to get raided by the police? Put it in a basement. Want to get your collective friends of Dorothy together? Have a party in the attic. And what's the excuse in the modern, more inclusive, every big brand grows rainbow for a month era? Capitalist imperatives. Owners and promoters clearly feel that they don't need to cater to the small and generally impoverished disabled market. That would cost too much to be accessible, and it's just too difficult. But really, is this not just ostensible concerns about safety perhaps concealing prejudice? In general, the more commercial side of the LGBTQ+ scene tends to be dominated by people with disposable income, highly focused on physical appearance and status. Still, which is weird, because I feel like the online gay space is so much more inclusive and diverse, to the extent that perhaps this year's Pride celebrations, being as they are online, will be better than any other when it comes to including as much of the community as possible. But meeting up with other like-minded people in person is a really valuable experience. And look, I'm not just complaining about how inaccessible nightclubbing is as a whole, although it is. If this were that, then, you know, it's kind of understandable. You could tell me to shush. I mean, it hurts, but we have to deal with it. No, we don't. Because this isn't just going into any old nightclub just because you fancy. This is taking part in a community that you are a part of. And when all Pride events are centred around drinking and partying, and all LGBTQ+ venues or meetups are centred around drinking and dancing, well, that's when it just becomes a real issue. Because it's no longer just that you're being excluded from something you want to do, you're being excluded from your own identity. More than entertainment venues, these are spaces where people make friends, meet partners, and find kinship and belonging. As a result, disabled queer people can end up doubly excluded and deprived of a place where they can be fully out and fully accepted, with both sexuality and disability taken for granted and celebrated. When I first moved to Brighton for university, and yes, I moved here purely because it was the gay capital of the UK and I was the disabled teenager who had zero romance. I looked up groups that welcomed lesbians but weren't based around the nightclubs, and I found a hiking group and a wine tasting group, and that was it. Not hugely helpful, my legs don't go far and my stomach riots at just the idea of alcohol. And I'm deaf, so I can't understand what's going on in a dark room. I just find drunk people really boring. But still, like the extroverted loner I was, I signed up for the wine tasting group and went along to find a lot of women over the age of 55, which is cool, but we didn't have huge amounts in common. 10 years later, and I have a group of not very straight friends, but I semi-collected them in roundabout ways, like we just happened to work together on something, or they once went on a date with my wife, or they were dating a girl who was once the object of obsession for a girl that I was friends with for 5 minutes. Yeah. Honestly, if I didn't have the very queer profession of being a YouTuber, I have no idea how I would make new lesbian friends. Popular lesbian social activities now, they just all stress physical performance. Fell walking, football, and Fast 5. The version of netball, not the 5th episode of the Fast and Furious franchise, which I would definitely get involved in. I can be a lesbian without having to prove I'm Superwoman, thanks. You know what else I don't have to prove about myself? Anything. Physical barriers and obstacles for disabled people at Pride can have a more significant implication. People with disabilities have been viewed as asexual beings or incapable of having other identities other than just being disabled. People are shocked all the time that I'm like more than that one thing. Oh my gosh, you're just so pretty for someone who's disabled. Look, I get it. People are a bit squeamish about someone who might need help going to the bathroom also having a sex life. As someone who has not gone to the bathroom by herself for about a month now, I understand. You can end up feeling like you're in two communities that don't fit together, and that can be a very isolating experience. It's important to include disabled people in Pride for not only our own good, yay, representation, you're not alone, but also to broaden the minds of others, because disabled LGBTQ people, we exist. The visible queer community should reflect the diversity of queer people. A lot of people assume that the LGBTQ+ community is super accessible and welcoming to disabled people because we're both marginalised communities, but as we've talked about, that isn't necessarily so. I'm sure you have your own thoughts on how to make that happen, but my suggestion is pretty simple, just hire disabled people. Many disabled members of the LGBTQ+ community want to be invited into a much more welcoming space, both literally and metaphorically, and this can be achieved by just listening to disabled members. It would be great to see more people within the top management of these things who have disabilities, and disabled speakers and performers on stage at Pride. Although we talk a lot about how the online space is just a series of echo chambers, it can also provide a lot of security within that. You'll always be able to find people on the internet who identify as you do, or share your feelings. Maybe you identify with me, in which case, cool, let's both not go fell walking together. Inclusion is more than blue handicap plaques slapped on every corner. Disability accommodation should not be an afterthought, but rather a priority when you're planning LGBTQ+ events and celebrations. Pride should strive to honour and recognise the lives of all people who identify as LGBTQ+, and clearly that includes people with disabilities. Share your tales of pride and accessibility in the comments below. Are they horror stories or... Actually no, my local pride's amazing, Jessica. Because this video is also super subjective and just my experience, and I'm massively privileged to be able to complain that pride is inclusive, but it's not quite like inclusive enough when around the world simply sharing my same identity is enough to get someone beaten up or put in prison. So let's take a moment to hold in our hearts all of the good things about Pride and how great it is that we get to paint the town rainbow for one weekend out of 52. Just saying. Thanks so much for watching, subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you in my next video. Oh my god, my back is killing me. I need to lie down.